I still remember the exact sound that hospital envelope made when it hit the vinyl chair beside me. Not loud, not dramatic, just a soft little slap that somehow carried more weight than everything else happening that night. My father was fading away one hallway over. My mother was fighting for every breath in the ICU across from him, and I was sitting there with cold coffee that tasted like burnt pennies when I opened a certified letter that demanded I pay an $8,500 HOA violation and vacate my grandfather's house within 14 days. If you've never had your entire world collapse in layers, let me tell you something. It doesn't happen all at once. It comes one envelope at a time. My name is Emily Carter. I was 29 years old then, serving as a captain in the Air Force Judge Advocate General's Corps, and while most people assumed I spent my days arguing over military regulations, my actual job often involved working alongside federal investigators on fraud and public corruption cases. Funny thing is, none of that mattered when I was sitting in that hospital wearing yesterday's jeans, trying to convince myself my parents would somehow both make it home. My grandfather's house wasn't just another property sitting on a quiet street outside Cedar Ridge. He built it himself in 1956 after coming home from Korea. Every floorboard had a story. Every dent in the old oak staircase reminded me of some childhood memory. The kitchen still smelled faintly like cedar because Grandpa insisted on lining every cabinet with cedar panels he cut himself. My dad learned to ride a bike in that driveway. I learned to throw a baseball in the backyard. Every Christmas, every birthday, every barbecue seemed to exist inside those walls. People like to say a house is just wood and nails. They've obviously never buried memories inside one. I barely finished reading the letter before I walked outside into the hospital parking lot because I didn't want my parents hearing me lose my temper. The number listed belonged to the Homeowners Association, so I called. After 3 rings, a smooth voice answered. Willow Creek Community Association. This is Daniel Hawthorne speaking. He sounded like the kind of man who smiled while charging late fees. I introduced myself, explained that there had to be some mistake, told him my parents were both in intensive care and that I needed a little time to sort everything out. There was silence for maybe 2 seconds before he laughed. Not a loud laugh. Worse. The quiet kind people use when they think you're beneath them. Miss Carter, he said, everyone has family problems. Your grandfather's military service doesn't exempt your property from community standards. I stared across the parking lot at the emergency entrance, watching nurses wheel someone inside while I tried to keep my voice steady. The house predates your HOA by decades, I replied. My grandfather built it long before your development existed. Another pause. Then you should have thought about that before violating our rules. Pay the fines or leave. Click. He hung up, just like that. No sympathy, no hesitation, no humanity. I stood there for another minute staring at my phone, honestly wondering whether I'd imagined the whole conversation because surely nobody could be that cold. Then my phone buzzed with another update from my aunt telling me my father's blood pressure had dropped again. And reality came crashing back. That night I couldn't sleep. Hospitals have a strange rhythm after midnight. The hallways get quieter, but somehow feel heavier. Families whisper instead of talking. Vending machines become dinner tables, and everyone wears the same exhausted expression. Around 1 in the morning, I carried my laptop into the nearly empty cafeteria. An elderly janitor nodded as he swept beneath empty tables, and an overnight nurse offered me half a stale blueberry muffin because she'd noticed I hadn't eaten all day. It's funny the people who show you kindness when you're falling apart. They're usually strangers. I opened the county property records mostly because anger gave me something to focus on besides grief. Within 15 minutes, I found my grandfather's original deed, 1956. Clean title, no HOA language anywhere. Then I found the incorporation filing for Willow Creek Community Association, 1987. I leaned back in my chair and actually laughed to myself. 31 years. 31 entire years separated those documents. They had absolutely no legal authority over my grandfather's property, unless someone had manipulated something afterward. That thought wouldn't leave me alone, so I kept digging. Property records turned into corporate filings. Corporate filings became tax documents. Tax documents led me toward campaign donations, zoning requests, and eventually, a limited liability company called Ridgestone Development. The name sounded familiar, though I couldn't remember why. Then I found it. A financial disclosure buried inside a public court filing showing Daniel Hawthorne had received $49,000 labeled as consulting fees only 8 weeks before our neighborhood suddenly became the target of aggressive code enforcement. I stopped breathing for a second. Consulting fees. From a developer trying to buy surrounding land. Now the pieces weren't just fitting together. They were snapping together like a completed puzzle. This wasn't about grass height. It wasn't about mailbox colors. It wasn't even about HOA rules. Someone wanted the older homes gone because they stood between a developer and a much larger expansion project. Families under pressure would sell cheap. Elderly owners would give up. People overwhelmed by medical bills would be the easiest targets. They hadn't picked my family because we broke the rules. They picked us because they thought we were too broken to fight back. I slowly closed my laptop, looked through the cafeteria window toward the glowing hospital lights, and for the first time since my parents had been admitted, my sadness made room for something else. Purpose. Daniel Hawthorne thought he'd found the weakest family in the neighborhood. What he had actually found was someone who knew exactly where corruption leaves fingerprints. The next morning, I walked back into my father's room carrying 2 coffees, one for me and one that I knew he'd never be able to drink. Habit is a strange thing. Even when the people you love are slipping away, your hands still remember what your heart hasn't accepted yet. My father was asleep. My mother hadn't regained consciousness. And for the first time in my life, I wished I could stop being the capable one. Stop being the daughter everyone expected to keep everything together. Instead, I opened my laptop again. Grief could wait another hour. Corruption couldn't. Ridgestone Development wasn't some local builder throwing up a few houses. They specialized in buying older neighborhoods piece by piece, then convincing city planners that redevelopment would increase tax revenue. There was nothing illegal about that by itself. What caught my attention was the timing. Every neighborhood they acquired seemed to experience a sudden wave of HOA violations, liens, and forced sales 6 to 12 months before Ridgestone submitted expansion proposals. Coincidence? Maybe once. Half a dozen times? Not a chance. I started mapping addresses, comparing ownership transfers, looking at public meeting minutes, and every hour the picture became uglier. Families had been pressured into selling after receiving violation notices almost identical to mine. Elderly widows, veterans, a retired school principal. One couple had lost their home while caring for a son with terminal cancer. Their story sat buried in county records under sterile legal language, but I could almost hear the desperation between every line. Someone had built an entire business model around finding people too exhausted to fight back. Around 10 that morning, my phone rang. The caller ID showed Daniel Hawthorne. I answered without saying hello. "Miss Carter," he began with that same polished voice. "Our board noticed you haven't responded to yesterday's notice. We'd hate for additional penalties to accumulate." I looked through the hospital window toward my father. "Do you enjoy this?" I asked quietly. "Enjoy what?" "Calling families while they're sitting beside dying parents." A brief silence followed before he cleared his throat. "Business isn't personal." I smiled even though he couldn't see it. "That's where you're wrong." He chuckled. "You know, attorneys always think they can scare people with legal language. I haven't used any legal language yet." "Then what are you doing?" I leaned back in the chair. "Research." The line went silent again. This time his pause lasted longer. "Research into what?" "You'll find out." I hung up before he could answer. Confidence sounds different when someone realizes they're no longer controlling the conversation. By lunchtime, I had assembled a timeline detailed enough to make any investigator curious. I could have handed everything to local authorities, but experience had taught me something important. Small-town politics often protect small-town corruption. If local officials were already compromised, tipping them off would only give everyone time to destroy evidence. Federal investigators don't ask permission. They ask for warrants. Around 3 that afternoon, I called an old colleague named Marcus Reed. We'd worked together on a procurement fraud case 2 years earlier, and he now supervised a federal financial crimes task force. He answered on the second ring. "Emily, this better not be another impossible favor." "Depends how you define impossible." 20 minutes later, we were on an encrypted video call. I walked him through everything I'd uncovered, one document after another. He interrupted only once. "Where did you get these banking disclosures?" "Public exhibits from an unrelated civil filing." He nodded slowly. "Interesting." Then I showed him the property timeline, then the developer payments, then the violation patterns. Finally, I shared copies of internal HOA emails I'd recovered from archived public records requests. One message stood out above the rest. Daniel Hawthorne had written, "We need 3 more voluntary sales before Ridgestone finalizes Phase 2. Elderly owners remained the easiest negotiations. Marcus didn't speak for several seconds. Finally, he leaned closer to the camera. "Emily, this isn't just unethical. I know. This looks like conspiracy. I know. Have you shown anyone else? No. He took a deep breath. Good. Don't. That afternoon became a blur of phone calls, encrypted file transfers, and sworn declarations. I drafted an emergency civil complaint challenging every action the HOA had taken against my grandfather's property. Then I prepared a criminal referral package outlining potential fraud, bribery, extortion, and civil rights violations. Every exhibit was numbered, every timeline cross-referenced, every financial transaction traced back to publicly available evidence. Years of legal work had taught me that emotions persuade people, documentation convicts them. Just before midnight, Marcus called again. The Bureau is opening a preliminary investigation. That was fast. Your evidence made it fast. How long? If everything checks out. He paused. Monday might be interesting. Sunday felt endless. My father never woke up again. I spent hours holding his hand, remembering fishing trips, old baseball games, and the way he'd pretend not to notice whenever Grandpa slipped me extra dessert before dinner. At one point, I caught myself wondering whether any of this even mattered anymore. Winning a lawsuit wasn't going to keep my parents alive. Exposing corruption wouldn't change what was happening inside those hospital rooms. Then I remembered something Grandpa used to say whenever someone tried taking shortcuts. Character isn't measured by what you protect when life is easy. It's measured by what you refuse to surrender when life hurts. Monday morning arrived gray and humid. Around 8:30, Marcus sent a text containing only 3 words. They're moving now. I drove from the hospital to my grandfather's neighborhood for the first time since receiving the violation notice. Everything looked painfully normal. Sprinklers watered perfect lawns. Kids waited for school buses. A man walked his golden retriever past my grandfather's porch like nothing extraordinary was about to happen. Then 4 dark SUVs rolled quietly into the subdivision. They didn't use sirens. They didn't need to. Federal agents don't announce themselves with noise. They announce themselves with paperwork. I parked half a block away. Daniel Hawthorne opened his front door wearing golf clothes, coffee mug in hand, already smiling at whoever had knocked. The smile disappeared almost instantly. One agent displayed credentials. Another handed him a search warrant. A third stepped inside before Daniel had finished reading the first page. Neighbors began peeking through curtains. Garage doors stopped halfway open. Dog walkers suddenly forgot where they were going. Within minutes, agents carried out computer towers, filing boxes, external hard drives, stacks of financial records, and several locked storage cases. Daniel stood on his driveway arguing with someone I assumed was his attorney over speakerphone. His face had turned a shade of pale I'd only seen on defendants moments before juries returned guilty verdicts. Then our eyes met across the street. Recognition hit him immediately. He started walking toward me until one of the agents gently stopped him with a hand across his chest. I stayed exactly where I was, calm, silent. He shouted something I couldn't hear. I didn't need to. His expression said enough. For the first time since this nightmare began, he understood he wasn't dealing with another frightened homeowner. He was staring at the person who had quietly dismantled the entire foundation beneath his feet, while sitting in a hospital beside 2 dying parents. 2 days later, Marcus called again. We've expanded the investigation. How bad? I asked. He laughed softly. Let's just say your HOA president has much bigger problems than neighborhood landscaping now. Prosecutors had traced payments through shell companies connected to Ridgestone executives. Email warrants uncovered conversations about targeting financially vulnerable homeowners. More families came forward after seeing news coverage of the federal search. A retired firefighter admitted he'd been pressured into selling after repeated threats of foreclosure. An elderly widow revealed she paid nearly $30,000 in fabricated fines because she was terrified of losing the house she'd shared with her late husband. Every new witness added another brick to the case until the entire operation collapsed under its own weight. By Friday, the HOA board had scheduled an emergency meeting. 3 directors resigned before it even started. Ridgestone publicly denied any wrongdoing, though 2 senior executives quietly hired criminal defense attorneys over the weekend. Daniel Hawthorne disappeared from every neighborhood social media group he'd once dominated. Funny how quickly bullies become invisible once someone turns the lights on. Late Friday afternoon, my phone rang one more time. The caller identified herself as Karen Ellis, the newly appointed interim HOA president. Her voice shook before she even introduced herself. Captain Carter, I think we need to talk. I looked out the hospital window one last time before answering. Yes, I said softly. I believe we do. Karen Ellis asked if we could meet that evening. Not at the HOA clubhouse, but at a little diner just outside the neighborhood, where nobody would be taking pictures through the windows. When I walked in, she was already sitting in a corner booth with a stack of folders and a face that looked like she hadn't slept in days. She stood the moment she saw me. "Emily, before we talk about anything else, I'm sorry." There wasn't a speech behind it. No carefully rehearsed corporate apology. Just 2 words from someone who had inherited a disaster she hadn't created. I sat down, ordered black coffee, and waited. She slowly pushed the folders across the table. "Every violation against your property has been withdrawn. The board voted unanimously this afternoon." I didn't touch the papers. "That's a start," she nodded. "We're also issuing written apologies to every homeowner who was targeted under Daniel's administration." "Good." "And," she hesitated, "our attorneys recommend a financial settlement if you're willing to resolve the civil claims." I finally opened the first folder. There it was, in writing. Every fine erased. Every lien withdrawn. Every collection action canceled. The HOA acknowledged that my grandfather's property had never legally fallen under its governing authority. It should have felt like victory, but all I could think about was the hospital room upstairs. "You'll need one more revision," I said calmly. Karen looked confused. "What kind?" "I want the acknowledgement recorded with the county, so no future board can pretend this conversation never happened." She blinked for a second, then gave a tired smile. "That's actually fair." "Not fair," I corrected gently. "Permanent." 3 hours later, their attorneys agreed to every condition. The settlement included compensation for legal expenses, public retractions, and recorded documents permanently protecting my grandfather's home from future HOA claims. They wanted confidentiality in return. I refused. "People deserve to know what happened," I told them. "Silence is why men like Daniel stay in power so long." The criminal case moved much slower than the headlines did. Federal investigations always seem quiet from the outside until one day they suddenly aren't. Over the next year and a half, I was interviewed more times than I could count. I testified before a federal grand jury. Financial analysts traced money through shell companies I'd never heard of. Digital forensic teams recovered deleted emails that Daniel thought had disappeared forever. One message in particular became central to the prosecution. He had written that families facing medical emergencies were less likely to hire attorneys and more likely to accept below-market purchase offers. Reading those words made me physically sick. My parents weren't business opportunities. Neither was anyone else's family. By the time the case finally reached court, several former HOA board members had accepted plea agreements in exchange for cooperating. Ridgestone executives denied knowing about the scheme, but documents told a different story. Contracts, wire transfers, internal memoranda. The paper trail never cared how expensive someone's lawyer was. I attended the sentencing without expecting much emotion. After months of hearings and legal arguments, everything had started feeling strangely clinical, just another case moving through another courtroom. Then the judge looked directly at Daniel Hawthorne and said, "You exploited trust, abused authority, and deliberately targeted vulnerable families for personal financial gain." The courtroom became so quiet I could hear someone turning pages behind me. 24 months in federal prison. Restitution to multiple homeowners. Financial penalties large enough to force the sale of his house and most of his remaining assets. As marshals escorted him away, he glanced back once. Not with anger anymore. Not even with hatred. Just disbelief that the rules he'd manipulated for so many years had finally applied to him too. A few weeks later, I unlocked my grandfather's front door for the first time in months. Dust floated through the afternoon sunlight exactly the way it always had. His old workbench still sat in the garage with half-finished projects waiting for hands that would never return. I walked into the living room where his bronze star rested beside a folded American flag, and for the first time since all of this began, I allowed myself to cry without trying to stop. My father passed away 3 weeks after that first letter arrived. My mother followed him less than 2 months later. They never got to see the search warrants, the courtroom, or the sentencing. They never saw the fear on Daniel's face when federal agents carried box after box out of his house. Sometimes I wish they had. But then I remember something my dad told me when I was a little girl after Grandpa fixed an old fence instead of arguing with the neighbor who broke it. Doing the right thing isn't about making sure everyone sees you win. It's about making sure the right thing survives after you're gone. Every time I unlock that front door, I think about those words. The house is still there. The front porch still creaks. The maple tree Grandpa planted still shades the driveway every summer afternoon. That's enough for me. But I'll admit something. Every now and then, when I drive past the empty house Daniel once called home, I can't help wondering how many other neighborhoods still have someone just like him sitting behind a polished desk, hiding greed behind community rules. So now I want to ask you something. If your family had been going through the worst moment of your lives and someone tried to take advantage of that pain for money, what would you have done? Would you have fought back? Or would you have walked away to protect your peace? I honestly don't think there's an easy answer. And that's exactly why I'd love to hear your thoughts. Share your opinion down in the comments because stories like this always spark incredible conversations. And if you believe ordinary people can stand up to abuse of power when they refuse to give up, make sure you like this video, subscribe to the channel, and I'll see you in the next story.